The climate crisis, as many other environmental issues, isn't a scientific problem. It's a social, political, and economic one. As they say, it isn't rocket science, it is greed. A Green New Deal will not cut it because it leaves capitalism, corporatism, imperialism, and consumerism in place. We aren't going to science our way out of these crises. We can't advertise or market our way out, shop our way out, sing and dance or entertain our way out, fundraise our way out, engineer and genetically engineer our way out, protest our way out, text, tweet, Snapchat, or Instagram our way out, pray our way out, or even vote our way out. Our way out is to dramatically alter much of our way of life. It is to prioritize ecological concerns and do our best to conduct every aspect of our lives sustainably, rather than just pay lip service to our belief that climate change is real, or that plastic pollution is a problem, or that fossil fuel use is unsustainable. In many, if not most ways, we just simply need to stop. Our way of life is incompatible with the continuance of life. Science communicator Kristine Mattis. If you're comfortable doing so, close your eyes and invite a few long, full, easy breaths. Allow yourself to breathe and soften and notice what you're sensing right now. Notice any emotion or lack of emotion you might be feeling. Notice any thoughts you might be having. I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, let's welcome Kristine Mattis, easily the most direct and sober and clear science communicator that I'm aware of. She's fresh back from a panel discussion and webinar with the folks over at Growth Busters. So let's hear what she has to say after that. Hi there, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. This is Dean Walker, and as you've already heard, our guest today is Kristine Mattis, whom I have on as often as I can. I find her to be one of the most articulate and potent science communicators around, and she's just recently back from having participated in a Growth Busters online webinar and panel Q&A discussion. And that included some alternative economic model conversation and also some population reduction conversation. And of course, Kristine Mattis in it as well, speaking about the wide range of topics that she usually covers. And this time she goes even broader by having some suggestions of really digging back into our history a few decades ago, and things that worked phenomenally well at that time in times of great stress in the USA, and brings them up for dusting them off and taking a look at them to address the many problems that we've got going on today. We're going to start straight into the conversation. It seems like it always goes that way with Kristine. where we just start talking and off we go. We don't do the regular introductions anymore. So I hope you enjoyed the opening section, which is obviously a quote from an earlier essay that, in fact, the first essay that really got my attention from Kristine Mattis. I just don't get tired of that. I think it's one of the most powerful, piercing quotes that is still very, very relevant today. So, and enjoy. I'll be putting all the information that you might need or want to connect up with a recording of that Ghostbusters, Growth Busters panel discussion that Kristine and I will talk about quite a bit in this conversation. So I hope you enjoy, and see you at the other end of this conversation.
And I do think this problem with the big environmental organizations needed to be illuminated. I think there is a fracture amongst the environmental movement that was already there before this film. I do know lots of people who've been marginalized in this movement because they don't necessarily go along with what these big groups are proposing as solutions. And if you're not in with their narrative, if you're not in with their marketing, you are pushed to the sidelines. And you know, I know academics who feel that way. I know people who run small environmental nonprofits who feel that way. Yeah. And of course, I really do think a lot of these local small environmental nonprofits are doing the real work in their communities. And they have so much trouble getting funding and so much trouble making any traction because all the money is going to these big organizations. And when it goes to these big organizations are, they really are doing the bidding of the corporate world and trying to find corporate solutions to the environment, which in my estimation, don't really exist. The corporate solutions, there's always a compromise for the economy. And besides that, markets change all the time. So sometimes these corporate solutions seem like a great economic deal, and then that could flip on a dime, depending on what's going on in markets. And I've seen this firsthand, and I've seen the problem with these big organizations. And I think that illumination in the film was important. Again, I don't know why Bill McKibben was such a focus. There's also this think tank called the Breakthrough Institute out of Oakland, California. And they are probably the biggest voice in eco-modernism, which is the sort of side of the environmental movement that is looking toward technological solutions and sort of presenting the idea that we can continue to live the way we're living and live in this modern technological utopian sort of future where we do deal with and rein in our environmental issues, but we also live the way we're living with all our gadgetry and all of our toys and all of our, you know, high-tech modern lifestyle. And I think that may have been more of a place to show some of the issues rather than focusing on one person and just a select few of these organizations. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I do think it was important though to illuminate some of these problems because I don't think people really know. And I do think what I've found and is frustrating to me is that the biggest voices in the environment, and they may not always do this and they may not be meaning to do this, but they seem to be selling people the idea that it was kind of like when Al Gore had The Inconvenient Truth. And at the end, the two solutions that the only two that I remember were change your light bulbs and buy a hybrid car and we'll all be good. Of course, that's ridiculous. And then the new environmental movement promoting the Green New Deal seems to sell people the idea that they don't have to do much personally in terms of change, that we have these solutions, let's get behind them politically, let's vote. And I think there is so much more to it. And I think we realistically need to tell people that we can have a much better world. We can have a world where we don't have to work 40 hours or 60 hours or 80 hours a week and do things that we are not happy doing, and do things that are more harmful to the environment, and not have time with our families, and not have time for respite. We don't need a world like that. But we're not going to change the world and have a better, greener, ecologically stable world by just changing politics and by just changing large-scale systems. We're going to have to change our ideas of what our lives should be like. And we are going to have to change from the top down. Certainly we need systemic change, but we need to change from the bottom up too. And you know, a lot of people in this current environmental movement who have the big voices are saying individual lifestyle changes don't do anything, or individual changes in the way you behave. And that's true. You know, me becoming a vegetarian, me not driving a car, that doesn't do anything for the big issues. But millions of people becoming vegetarians, millions and multi-millions of people not driving cars, and multi-millions of people changing the way we conceive of our life and conceive of a good life, certainly makes changes. And that's exactly the kind of changes we need. In fact, during this coronavirus, I would say that we didn't have systemic changes. We had collective change on the individual level, that, you know, we all stopped driving for a while. We all stopped doing a lot of the normal things we've internalized as a normal way of life. Now, some of these things we want to get back to, and we should get back to. Others of which we should internalize as that wasn't normal, that was harmful to us, to the environment, to other people, and maybe this is how we need to live our life forward. Mm-hmm. And so I do think one of the things that Planet of the Humans brought out, and that a lot of people who have the biggest voices in the environment are not talking about, is that we need to conceive of a different way of life, mm-hmm. Especially, particularly in the first world, the global north. And maybe they think it's too much for people to handle. Maybe they think people are not ready to say, I want a different way of life. I don't know. For me, I think there's a lot of people suffering in this world. There's a lot of people suffering here in the United States. And I think they do want a different way of life. Yeah. And I think these carrots we've hung out as the good life, the American dream, they aren't, and they never proved to be. All of these material things, mm-hmm. all of the fame and the fortune that we see as the good life is not bringing anybody happiness. And it's proven to be that way. Our country has like the highest rates of depression and anxiety. And this is not happening from simple personal reasons. It's happening at a societal level. So I think the good life can be seen as something new. And I think that's something, for some reason, the environmental movement doesn't want to say. Maybe they think it's too complex. We just want to promote these green technologies right now, and then we'll get to that after. I don't know their thinking, because I'm not in the realm of, you know, the people who are really structuring that narrative. But I think it's problematic, because I think we are in such a, as you always say, we're in a collapse, and at this point we need everything on the table. We need to talk about all these things. And the longer we wait to tell people, you know what, we might not be able to have these computers. We might not be to continue to have a smart grid in a sustainable world in the future. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's nothing, and I've said this before, and I get a lot of heat from this, there is nothing sustainable about this technology, the internet, Wi-Fi, smartphones. It's an environmental nightmare. And forget about if it were all powered on green energy. It's all our waste is going to the third world, and it's so destructive for their health, for their environment. And to pretend we can, you know, create a smart grid and that's going to solve things with green energy, it's just not, it's not reality, it's delusion. And so for me, that's where I think that the film had some good points to bring out, and I think that needs to be discussed. And maybe, I think both sides who support the film or the people who made the film maybe were a little too harsh to those they portrayed in the film. And the sides that are coming out attacking the film, I think there's a lot of hurt and a lot of harshness between the both of them. And I wish there could be more discussion, because I definitely think that the film was needed, because there are some deficiencies in the environmental movement.
Yeah, thank you. There was one point that I recall you making in that panel discussion on the Growth Busters, the recent Growth Busters panel, about, that was originally sparked by Michael Moore's film, the whole dream of replacing fossil fuel use with renewables, and how fundamental that is to things like the Green New Deal, or really just about any environmental cause that has anything to do with climate. You're dead in the water if you're not including that in, top to bottom. And I forget exactly how you put it, but the statistics that I've heard are that the amount of renewables that are actually online have barely been keeping up with the increase in demand during that same time. So, how much of that is causal because of the lower price that's offered and so on, that's up for grabs, and clearly a part of the conversation somewhere. But the important part to realize is so far, even with all the benefits and progress that have been made of installing renewable energy sources, we have not even kept up with our own growing appetite as a global population. So this talk about a pipe dream and magical thinking, this is supposedly at the center of the alternative reality that we're all going to create together. If everybody wanted to get on board and vote for it, let's just say this year, woohoo, that the scale, the sheer industrial scale, to get any substantial part of that replacement going on is staggering.
Yeah.
Is absolutely staggering. So it loops me back to what you were just saying, and I do appreciate you bring a kind of a balanced view of the film and the critiques of it, and I appreciate that. But I tend to agree with you that what we are needing, the word revolution has been showing up an awful lot on various articles that I've been reading and so on. I'm a huge fan of XR, of Extinction Rebellion. I have been an organizational development consultant for a long time, and at a fairly low level, but I have always dreamt of, what if I could be a part of creating some aspirational organization, especially an activist organization that would bring about progressive change. That's like my dream. And there are many things that they're doing far beyond anything I've ever imagined. The level of transparency and effectiveness and inclusion is staggering and inspiring. But with all of that, there are certain pieces of the puzzle that I still can't see how to come anywhere near getting my arms around it, including them in a conversation like this, not to mention policy changes and so on. And so when I get back to that word revolution, I'm fairly clear about the efficacy and the necessity of a nonviolent expression in the world, because the powers that be are so merciless and so gigantic that the violent suppression of anything that would show up in terms of violence or that kind of resistance would be excruciating. So I'm pretty clear on that. But then there's this gaping hole of, so if not that, then what?
Mm-hmm.
You know, because this notion of revolution just means some huge discontinuity, some complete and utter fracturing of our core as a global people.
Yep.
From how it's always been.
Yeah.
And then being able to somehow just even find a moment's breath in that disconnected space together to then formulate something entirely new.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I'm wondering if that sparks you to say anything. And I'm also very curious, perhaps back from Revolution, are you seeing any thoughtful or inspirational threads that you are able to pull on for both inspiration, perhaps clarity, and perhaps some notion of what's possible?
I have a few thoughts on that. First of all, I was talking to someone yesterday about revolution because it's really funny to me that so many people are so proud of this country and our revolutionary history and how we began, and yet at this point we're not willing to think about another revolution. And you know, I think we need a revolution on multiple scales. I tend toward believing in the nonviolent revolution because it doesn't seem like violence usually accomplishes anything for the better. I mean, our country was started with violence, but we also had a bunch of slave owners and a bunch of, you know, rich, wealthy landowners who are our founding fathers. And, you know, that was sort of the paradigm of our country. So that wasn't necessarily a good thing. But I think we need two kinds of revolutions. Maybe a nonviolent revolution that has to do with noncompliance, which means we have to stop thinking about living this way we live and following all the rules that are dictated in our society. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what Extinction Rebellion is doing, and I think that's really important. But either prior to that or concurrent with that, I think we need a revolution of our minds. And that is realizing that, I think first of all, we have to realize that we are not workers, we are not consumers, and most of all consumers, because that is what we've been told to be for pretty much my whole lifetime. Mm-hmm. You are born, you are working toward a certain job, mostly you're aspiring toward a job, mostly not because it's something to do good in the world to help other people, mostly because you want to make money and you want to consume more because the person who has the most toys in the end wins. You know, that kind of mindset needs to go completely. I've been thinking a lot now that we need more aspirational, or we need more inspirational models than aspirational models. This country is built on aspiration, mostly material and superficial aspiration, and we need inspiration. So that's like a revolution of the mind, to think about living, aspiring to something different and living in a different way. But then we have to think about actual revolution. And as I said, in terms of non-compliance, in terms of not living the way we're told to live and not following the rules we're told to follow when they are unjust and environmentally harmful rules. And in order to do that, another thing I was talking to someone about yesterday and that I've been thinking about and should write about soon is we need to, for those of us who have some of it, and a lot of people don't, we need to be willing to give up our comfort. Mm-hmm. Nothing has ever changed in history by the comfortable. Everything that is important, the important and good changes we've made, whether in this country or throughout the world, is always done with a lot of discomfort and a lot of loss and a lot of sacrifice. And I think for me personally, that's one of the things I see as problematic with this the current large environmental movement and the biggest voices, because they are really selling this thing that you could be as comfortable as ever, and we can all be as comfortable as ever in this way that we've grown to think of comfort, and we can still have an ecologically sustainable world. And that I don't see as reality.
Yeah.
So that's some of the things I was thinking about. And in terms of industrialization, I think that's an important thing. A lot of people are talking about bringing down capitalism, that we need a more democratic socialism or socialist society. That will help a lot. We need eco-socialism. Not that there's anything wrong with that, and that I don't agree with those ideas in terms of changing systems. But I think one thing that we still are clinging to is industrialization and consolidation. And like you said, these large scale industries, nothing about them is sustainable. So when we're talking about moving toward renewables, I don't think anybody who's in the environmental movement, who cares about the environment, is saying we don't need renewable energy. But the scale at which we need it, or the consolidation of it into large scale infrastructures may be one of the problems. Of course, not only because large scale means large industrial manufacturing, which is totally unsustainable in so many ways, but it also means a consolidated authority running it, which is also problematic. And it probably means more capitalism and more people making money off of it, and more people having an economic interest, which again, the interest of whatever technology can change on a dime depending on the market. So I think industrialization and globalization of these kinds of solutions and these kinds of technologies is a problem. And we, you know, people have had these solutions for so long. E.F. Schumacher, small is beautiful. Localization of so many things, I think, is the key. Of course, we can't localize everything, but having localized economies and localized agriculture and localized energy at a very small scale, localized to the point of your own home, I think really is the kind of changes we need. And as a matter of fact, I haven't been able to watch it, but there is someone from Europe who recently put out a video speaking about how in his research, he's seeing climate change go off the rails way more than even like 4 degrees Celsius increase by the end of the century, more like 10 degrees. And if that's true, you know, we're not going to be alive, but he's talking about the only way to solve it is localization.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that means changing everything we're used to. That means something like Amazon.com doesn't exist. Right. And in my estimation, something like Amazon.com shouldn't exist. And you know, when I hear Jeff Bezos or the Amazon sustainability person talk about we're moving toward net zero carbon emissions, or we're already using 90%, 99% renewables. Well, I think of something like before Amazon.com existed, there were no carbon emissions from Amazon.com. So say their carbon emissions now are at 1 billion. Well, 1 billion of whatever metric. Well, if you have reduced that by 999,999,999, you still have, you know, you've taken out almost all the carbon emissions, but you still have so much more percentage. Even if you've taken out 99%, you still have all these carbon emissions that didn't exist before. Right. And then beyond that, you still have, near where I live, they're trying to build a new Amazon, what do they call them? The euphemism for factory, distribution center, or fulfillment center, actually, right. Not even distribution. And there's a whole forested area that they're going to chop down for this humongous, you know, multi-football stadium size distribution center. So you can go to net zero carbon emissions, and that's a real huge footprint on the environment.
Yeah.
So things like that have to change. And it's funny when I hear people who care about the environment talking about ordering things from Amazon.com and getting new smartphones. And I think I understand we're all kind of tied to some of this stuff, but we have to, first of all, try to untie ourselves as best we can and envision a future where we're not tied to these kind of things, because they are not sustainable. And until you can show me how they are, then we need to think about maybe not having them.
Yeah. Well, two things come to mind, Kristine, and thank you for that layout of what for you and me is quite obvious. I appreciate that. I'm curious if you've heard of a guy named Tim Garrett.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think he's a physicist. Gosh, I'm embarrassed that I'm not remembering his titles and degrees. I believe he's in the University of Utah, and his claim to fame in terms of what I've been aware of him publishing and speaking about for quite some time is that through his estimations, calculations, projections, that where he's landed is that society as we know it is a heat engine. And it really fits very, very well with what you were just saying. They might get to net zero at some gigantic fulfillment center. That's great. But exactly what you said is completely missed in the calculus. It's that everything we do is generating heat. And what we're talking about being a problem in this controlled, contrived narrative that is climate change in the first place is we're supposedly wanting to reduce our emissions so we stop heating the planet. So I'll send you a link, and I'll include the link in the show notes for this conversation, to a couple of interviews with Tim Garrett. I have found him to be, if you really listen to what he's saying, and which was exactly in the center of what you were just saying, that this is not a controllable narrative where we just reduce one element and everything goes on just fine.
Right.
No, we have a systemic deep sickness that it's impossible to find a piece of our web of life that isn't impacted by every other piece.
Right.
And now we are the most pernicious piece of all. And we are having the greatest impact of all. And so to think about anything less than the revolution level scale that I believe we're both pointing at aspirationally, is to continue to be in this completely disconnected view of ourselves on this planet. Which again, just to, I'm sorry to be repetitive because I know you've heard me say it before, but for those who haven't, the center of my work with the writing The Impossible Conversation a few years ago is that what got us here into this existential predicament is that we've disconnected from every source of meaning in human life and every significant relationship in the web of life.
Yeah.
And that's the only way the average person can see, is to see I'm an individual and I'm going to go buy something. And that has nothing to do with you or any part of the planet or anything else. So F you. I mean, I'm being a little silly, but really not too far off, because we are obviously on a self-destructive track that I never would have guessed that in my old guy lifetime I would have seen the amount of collapse and suffering and eventually die off that have long been predicting. And I
Yeah,
keep wanting to be proven wrong. I keep
I
looking
know.
long and hard because I don't want this to happen. I
Hmm.
want to be able to dial up stuff on an Amazon or anything else. I want to fly around and I want to go see things and I want to consume. I want a realization of a dream where human beings are actually connected enough with the web of life that they start to choose based on what supports life rather than some ridiculously kind of crippled, stunted, tribal preference. So thank you for letting me rant. I apologize. I didn't know I would quite go that far. I'll climb down off my soapbox. And I'm very thankful that that y'all got together with Dave and did that webinar and the panel conversation. I'm curious. I'm just going to loop us back one more time and see what you might be thinking about. How do we start to approach things like, there's another point that you made in the panel discussion that is a really big deal for me, is what got us out of the last depression was an aligned, unified expression. And one thing that really struck me was the tax rates for wealthy people were taken up a number of different times to pay for this stuff. And it also yielded the greatest expansion of possibility and true growth in this nation and the world's history. So, when we're talking upwards of 90% and so on for a tax rate for the wealthiest, again, I was giving my little applause when I was listening to the recording of your panel discussion. I'm curious if there are elements like that that seem within reach and certainly within memory that you kind of hold as real potential in this time. Any more ideas up your sleeve?
Oh gosh, I don't know. It's interesting because I wasn't even thinking of talking about it, but I do think that fundamentally we're not going to be able to change anything until we have a redistribution of wealth and that people's needs are taken care of and the wealthy, and we're going to have to pry it out of their cold dead hands, basically, like Charlton Heston said, because there, I'm sure you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We can't have people become, well, there's an irony. First of all, the people who have the least are doing the least harm to the environment, but they can't be like consciously trying to always work on the environment and work on environmental issues and live in a sustainable way, because they need to just get the basic necessities of life. And of course, in a moral society, no one would be scrambling for the basic necessities of life. However, in our society, the majority of people are doing just that. I mean, I relate to that. I have my own precarious situation, and it's certainly not the same as many other people who are struggling horribly, but there's so many who are really just struggling to get by and struggling to meet basic needs for themselves and their family. And so thinking about all these other things, it can't even be in their realm. And that needs to change. And then, of course, by taxing the wealthiest, those are the people who are doing the most damage, and we need to somehow curtail the damage. But in terms of, I mean, I don't know, other than, you know, high marginal tax rates, like I said, we're going to have to pry their belongings, their ill-begotten wealth out of their cold, dead hands. And one way I see of doing it, again, is this just revolution of our mindsets. We are fed so many illusions. We are fed so much that we have internalized as normal that is absolutely insane, absolutely immoral, absolutely unjust and unethical. And one of those things is that aspiring to and gathering wealth and gathering excess material goods beyond your needs is a good thing, and that people are deserving of that, and people have worked hard for that. That could be a whole topic of an entire podcast going hours and hours of why that's untrue. But one of the things is I think people have to stop putting the wealthy, the entrepreneurs, the billionaires, but not even just the billionaires, on a pedestal, because these people have exploited the environment and exploited other people. Many of them have stolen. I mean, look at Bill Gates. He stole intellectual property to get his riches. And not only do they get to this point, but then they dictate how we deal with a lot of our societal problems. You know, Bill Gates has huge influence now in education and in health. Mark Zuckerberg, yes, his wife is a doctor, but they have a foundation, and they are basically, it seems to me, trying to dictate how we're going to deal with global health. And this is untenable, to have a few voices of billionaires and people who have wealth, who gain that wealth through doing all the wrong things, further dictating how we're going to solve all our problems, because these are the same people that created the problems in the first place. How to deal with that and how to change that, I think we have to start by changing our minds about these people. I was thinking about some indigenous societies, and I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't have a great expertise in this, but I know that in other societies, either in the past or perhaps some that still exist today in indigenous cultures, when there are people who take too much more than they need, or who are acting in an antisocial sort of way and not helping the community, they are shunned. They are not looked upon as people who've made it good. They are shunned by these societies. And I think we need a little more of that. I said something to that effect in this webinar I was on, and someone reacted not positively to that. But I have to say, I really don't think we can keep saying it's okay to take more than your fair share in the world. And, you know, people who have multiple homes when others are homeless, people who have all this exotic food and all these material items when others cannot even get food on the table. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. Children know this. You know, this is kind of fundamental wisdom that we seem to have forgotten. And actually, that was something I wanted to say, is that we have so much science, we have so much information, we have so much data, we have so much research, and it doesn't seem to be doing us a whole lot of good. And I think that's because when you put it all together, you have to have a moral to the story. You have to have a takeaway from all this information, and that takeaway is wisdom. And I think we've lost the wisdom. And I think that's where we need to bring in some of this, you know, that scientific knowledge is only one form of knowledge that seems to be the one we are most relying on. But there is also indigenous knowledge, and a lot of indigenous knowledge is more of wisdom. Indigenous cultures may have not known about cell biology. They may have not known about specific ways. They may have not known the mechanism of medicinal healing, but they certainly knew medicines that could heal them. And sometimes we don't need to necessarily know the mechanisms. The wisdom is what we need more of in our society, I think. And I say this as a scientist, but these are some of the problems I see in science itself, you know, having been within it. So that's something I think, again, I think a lot of this has to do with societal changes at the personal level and at the cultural level, and the stories we tell each other, these stories that are destructive, and the stories are for the benefit of the people who have the most and want to gain the more. And these stories are fictional. We have to realize these stories that we've internalized about how to live and what's right to do in our society, a lot of them are fictional, and they don't benefit most of us.
Yeah.
And those of us who can tell new stories and pass on these new stories, that might be something helpful.
Yeah. I appreciate you bringing up about the story thing. That is another topic we could spend a whole lot of time on, because it seems like there's a lot of just flat out magical thinking going on without much in the way of, you know, solid, like, so how do we collect any kind of collective agency? How do we reclaim any collective agency to be able to truly influence the story that we live in, the narratives that we call normal? But again, that's a whole different topic. I'm wondering if I could just loop back for a second to the Extinction Rebellion. Has one of their principles is one in which they say we operate in a no shame, no blame environment, which for sure on the individual level, I get it. You know, there's just no place in which that kind of a dynamic is going to be fruitful and especially in an organization that's trying to do good as they are. Where I start to wonder about it is you and I are both talking about what Charles Eisenstein might call the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Like, there's got to be a better way. You know, we could say it as the way he says it, or we could say it some other way, but the core message seems to be things are not okay now. And in order to get to something that is truly sustainable, regenerative, call it what you will, the more beautiful world, it's going to take something. And so there's kind of a conflation here that I would love to hear if you have any thoughts about it. Again, I think in essence, the no shame, no blame conversation and principle, I get it. You know, keep it in place, use it on the interpersonal dynamic in XR, yes. Where I start to wonder, so how do we start to express, if we were to reclaim some of our collective agency, long ago forfeited agency, we'd start to be able to express ourselves collectively in a way that is bold and strong and does have a clear message of equity, of fairness, of stewardship of the commons. And yet we really don't have that going on. There's also, how on earth do we hold violators to account?
Yeah.
Without, because it's one thing when there's laws and there's active agencies that you can call on and things, the rule of law actually works. And that's clearly through the autocratic, you know, ways of governing that are really filling in all the available gaps these days. It wasn't great before that, and it's gone way downhill. I'm wondering, how do we hold corporations, the wealthy, the truly the violators, the people who are conscious, know that they're doing harm, know that they're reaping the benefits, the wealth from an extraction, and leaving the trash for everybody else to live with. How do we hold violators to account if we overuse or don't discern where something is truly a violation and truly needs to be named, called out,
Yeah.
enforced, and stopped? To me, there are a number of world scale, global scale elements that are that way right now.
Yeah.
We won't have an Amazon within my lifetime if
Mm-hmm.
it keeps going this way. It
Mm-hmm.
just keeps accelerating. We for sure won't have coral reefs. That's already a given. That's already baked in. So there's two parts of my question that you're welcome to respond to either one or neither one, whichever you'd like. How do we hold violators to account to be able to just stop the bleeding? Because it ain't stopping on its own.
Right.
And then the other points which you were making so well about creating a radical redistribution of wealth, which involves a realization of and a valuing of the commons, which we have so obviously not only lost but have a true disdain for. We're a death cult, global death cult, annihilating the commons, as far as I can see.
Yeah.
And then to include in that redistribution of wealth the obvious issues of equity and fairness. These are both massive shifts of consciousness, and I hope I've just like crystallized them. It's always so vague for me when so, well, we need a breakthrough in consciousness. We need an evolution of consciousness. Yeah, what does that mean? And to me, this is a little bit more of an articulation of this is what I mean by an evolution of consciousness.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to respond about either of those?
I don't know if I certainly don't have all the answers. That's for sure. I guess I didn't realize about Extinction Rebellion's no shame, no blame or decree. I don't, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, because like you said, on the one hand, I understand we don't want to alienate people who would be on our side. But, I guess this is what I'm thinking. For those who are purposefully extracting everything from the planet and who don't care about the mess they're leaving, who don't care that they have more than everyone else, who don't care that they are the plunderers and don't care who or what they're plundering, I don't think we're going to change any of their minds. And so I don't think it's a problem to instill some kind of shame and guilt. Maybe guilt is the right word. It's funny, I was brought up in the Catholic tradition. I'm no longer a Catholic, but anyone who is Catholic or Jewish or probably many other religions has either shame or guilt or both, in there. And in many ways, it's not a great form of shame and guilt that we were brought up in these religions, but I think we've come to a society where that is gone. And I think it is a problem that we don't have some guilty feelings. People who say they've worked hard their whole life, I've bought all this stuff, I've wanted this stuff, I've earned it, and don't feel shameful that they are living in this colossal mansion and walking over the homeless in their midst. I think that's a problem. And that's one humongous example and one ridiculous example. But I think we have areas to feel a little guilty and shameful, those of us who are doing okay in this world. And the interesting thing is, I think when you talk to people who really care about the predicament we're in and care about others and care about the planet, and you talk with kindness and love and compassion, I think you can bring out these kinds of ideas that we should feel a little guilty or should feel a little shameful in our material wealth or in our inequality and in the things we do that we could change personally. And I think sometimes an initial reaction is defensiveness. But I think for those people who really care and really think, and I've experienced this personally, when I've brought up certain ideas to people and then this idea might hit them at a personal level, the initial reaction might be defensiveness, but those kinds of decent, caring people take it and then they think about it and they say, maybe you're right. Maybe I could be thinking about this in a different way. Initially, it hurt me personally because, it's a personal thing, whatever it is, that the way I'm living or something. But I think that's something we need to broach some topics that are maybe uncomfortable about broaching. For one thing I'm thinking about is, air travel is extremely harmful. There are a lot of scientists in the environmental realm, a lot of researchers who are trying to curtail their air travel or who have curtailed it completely. There are a lot of people trying to do things personally and model personal behaviors that need to change if we're to deal with this predicament. And then at the other hand, there's a lot of people who are big names in the environment who do these things like travel all over the globe and go on excursions, and they say it's to show us what's wrong with the environment around the world, or they're going on book tours all over and there is some hypocrisy in that, and often it's the right wing who brings that out and says, you're a hypocrite, you don't care about the environment, you're doing this. And of course we don't want the right wing to be saying you're a hypocrite so the environment doesn't matter, because of course they take that and then they throw out everything. But there's some truth to that hypocrisy, and I think we need to realize that, and we need to do our best to model better behaviors, or at least say, look, I am trying to, I have a book about the environment and I really care about this world. I really care about climate. I really care about our ecological predicament. I am traveling around. And this is something that I know I need to change. At least acknowledge that this is something that I need to change, that we all need to change, and I'm going to try to do better in the future. Or maybe I can't do a book tour anymore, something like that. I think we need to acknowledge that kind of what the right wing puts out as hypocrisy, because many times it is. And there's some people, it just seems like some people think, well, I am so important in my work in the environment or my work on sustainability that I have to do this. But other people shouldn't. I know it's not a good thing, but I have to do it. And that there is some hubris in that too. And I don't know, that might be getting way off topic, but those are some things I've been thinking about. And I think we all need to think about what we're modeling. I know we're always talking about systemic changes, and believe me, I am all for systemic changes, and I know we need to change our systems, and I know we need to change our economic system, but I also think change comes at every level, and some of this behavior that we do, we can't say that we really care about the environment and we know things need to change and then just live in this in a very basically capitalistic and commercial and consumeristic way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, that's what I've been thinking about lately.
Funny, maybe it's just my looking, but during this virus pause time, I've been looking for the articles that give me a sense of, with the reduced activity, commercial activity in the world during this pause, how much of a reduction has happened, and where has that reduction come from? Is it from more the individual consumption patterns, or is it on some industrial scale? And a few folks have been putting out some statements about that and some measures of that. And you know, it comes down to it's the individual reductions of consumption and emissions are just a really small portion of what we're actually talking about. Now, as a cultural expression, which is, I think, a big part of what I was hearing you just talk about, yeah, it does make a difference how we express ourselves, how we participate in this business as usual culture. I absolutely get that. And that may communicate as importantly as any sort of activist statement we might want to come up with. And I got to just, you know, on a strictly personal sharing level, when I put together, you know, I actually call these in a chapter in what wants to become my next book. I have a chapter called The Insanities. They're so insane that we don't even talk about them anymore. They're that insane. They become invisible. They're that insane. One of them is that we just never talk about the number one fossil fuel consumer on the planet.
The military.
Which is the US military.
Right.
And we don't talk about how that's just between that and even a small portion of the surveillance state, we're talking about $1 trillion a year.
Yeah.
And it just never gets talked about. Never. Right. When I nudge in that direction, well, it really just speaks an awful lot to why I've ended up where I've ended up in my body of work, which is to work with individuals in very small organizations to provide resources and support for those who are brave enough to see the human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. And to be able to do that, the only thing I know to do that is to keep gathering what I like to call advanced practices from all the different wisdom traditions and embodiment traditions and so on. You know, transformational training organizations and I don't know how else to get a foothold that I don't even call it hope anymore, because hope is kind of a dirty word in my lexicon. It's so badly used. But to try and get a sense of how can we salvage meaning at this stage of a game that is so obviously built to self-destruct. When I look at those insanities, and the list is quite long. The military one's a big one. It's everybody understands it, and we'll still not talk about it tomorrow, you know. When I go there to that scale, I can very quickly slide into a very direct experience of disempowerment, of having my what agency I've recovered, have it sucked back out of my system.
Yeah.
And what it takes is an immense commitment to find and cultivate and expand my own sense of center, my own sense of energetic wholeness and wellness and relational wellness, you know, returning to, if not the insanities, then what? And it's the then what that it makes it worthwhile to get out of bed in the morning for me. And I'm wondering, you are one of the most aware folks I know, one of the most articulate folks I know about facing the insanities.
I'm curious, are there particular ways that you're keeping yourself sane, that you're keeping yourself self-regulated, co-regulated, connected? Are there any particular practices that you've got integrated that help you stay connected with the web of life in some good way? And these are all my ways of saying it. You may have a very different way of saying these things.
Well, for myself, I think there's one of the things that's keeping me fairly sane is having recently in recent years connected with so many people who are, I feel, the voiceless, because we're served with these things, like you said, that are insane, that are considered normal in our society, and that we've internalized as normal, that are actually insane. And I've connected with so many people who see them for the insanity there is. And forgive my my profanity, but I think some people have appreciated my writing and have gotten in touch with me because what I try to do is just try to say, you know what, that's bullshit, and here's why. And we're not getting a lot of that, and we're not getting enough of that for so many reasons, and most of them are have to do with capitalism and has to do with careerism, and it's not comfortable, and it's not a good career decision to call out the bullshit all the time or ever. But so connecting with people who feel that way and who see it has been wonderful. But just on a day-to-day level for me, and it's always been this way, getting outside, connecting with nature, taking long walks, like where I am now, I'm able to go in the woods and see all sorts of wild animals and get a little exercise. And that is, I would probably be utterly depressed and feeling insane if I weren't able to do that. And it's funny, this is just sort of a side note, but I haven't belonged to a gym in probably 30 years. And I've purposefully, for reasons of the environment, tried to always get exercise outside somehow. And using no electricity and using no materials, or the fewest materials I can. And this is one of those things where being outdoors and being in nature, if you are able to, not everybody is able to in urban environments, but getting some exercise and getting some, just even walking in, I think is so important for everybody, for their health, for their mental health. And the interesting thing is, so many people during this pandemic are wanting to go back to their gyms. And gyms, yes, they're a place where you can meet people, so it's a social thing, and that's good. And yes, you can get exercise, but it's repetitive exercise on machines that are using so much energy and so many materials. And to me, it's kind of utter insanity. And these are the kinds of things that I think we need to think about and say, you know what, we shouldn't have these gyms. And if we do, there is a place in Hopland, California, which is north of San Francisco, called the Solar Living Institute. And they have exercise bicycles outside of their building that you sit on, and you create the energy for the electricity in the building. How insane is it that we still have these gyms for people to get healthy that are using so much energy, instead of using the manpower that we actually create the heat? Like you said about the physicists, we're creating this heat, we should use it for good rather than, taking more energy when we're really actually creating energy. So that's sort of a side note, but yeah, the things I do are getting away from like the screens and getting away from the inundation of consumerism and high tech and materialism, and just connecting with nature if I can, and getting my body moving. Those are probably the best things I do for my own sanity.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. You know, I think I heard you. I don't quite know what you said, but I want to put in a vote in case you were saying that you regret some of the strength, the potency of some of your writings. You know, the straight communication piece that you were just talking about. I got to let you know that that's why I just love having you come back as often as you will here, because I am so tired of science communicators trying to feed me some sort of party line, which is a combination of neuroscience and babble. And you know, it just it has not been working for me with some other folks and how they do it. It's been your direct style that has been a very important and very inspiring piece for me. So I'm going to actually include the first quote from the first piece that I was aware of in your writing a couple of years ago that just mind-blowingly great. So I'll be including that as probably as a way to start this particular episode of the podcast. I'm curious though, if I could just shift one last question for you, because you did just mention that to be the one that calls bullshit can be limiting in terms of career advancement and how willing people are to publish your work and so on. Believe me, I know that. In my book, The Impossible Conversation, I was coached time and again to back off and throw out half of it. And the bad news is my next book is even worse. But in any case, shifting gears from that, when it becomes a more personal conversation and a sharing, rather than what you write professionally and what you share in that way, I'm curious if you've come to any realizations, any, not conclusions, but ways that you operate when it's a more heart-to-heart or it's a more interpersonal exchange that matters, that you want to have continuity with this relationship. This is, and so I'm curious if there's a way that you've come to share these things that are very important to you. I'm sorry if you can hear some noise outside. It should be quieting down in just a moment. All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your patience. Kristine Mattis joining us here on the Poetry of Predicament. This last question that I wanted to just find out if you've landed in any particular place that offers some ease and some rapport building with people when you want to share with them some of the things that are most important for you around environmental issues or socioeconomic issues, the things that you speak about so well. I'm curious if you've landed on ways to share that stuff that seem to work better, that seem to invite them to share what's important to them too, and leave you both in pretty decent shape at the end of the conversation. Anything you can share about that?
You know, honestly, I'll say on an interpersonal level amongst, generally friends and family, it's sometimes a difficult thing because I have friends and family who have different ideas and opinions than I do. And sometimes when I know our, I guess, ideologies collide, I'm reticent to share everything. And sometimes I just interject what I can when I hear a lot of sort of the conventional wisdoms being reiterated that I know are just untrue and just brainwashing. sometimes I try to interject when there's something scientific being said when I'm really the only scientist in the room. But it's very difficult amongst people that I know who have strong opinions, maybe in a totally diametrically opposite way. Amongst people who have contacted me that I don't know really well, you know, this is interesting because I'm not really into social media. I've just started doing a little bit on Twitter, and I'm not even sure if I'm going to stay. I'm not really that interested in it, but I see a lot of vitriol. I see a lot of anger toward and really emotionally quick anger. Everybody's quick to anger and quick to accuse, and I don't like it at all. And I've gotten some of the, no, I haven't gotten much. I've gotten very many wonderful exchanges on email from people that I don't know. But I have gotten some that are kind of like what you see on the internet, that immediate anger. I don't like what you said about this, and this is why, and what do you think, or what are you going to do about it, or something like that. And I really always try to write back to everybody who writes to me. And unless someone's really threatening or something, I try to engage, and I try to, and I'm not as good at this in my personal real life, but on the internet, I really do try to sit back, calm down, and peacefully and calmly sort of I'm sorry, not exchange, but present my position or present what I'm thinking and acknowledge what that other person's thinking and not react with vitriol. And I have actually found the few people who've written to me with that kind of anger have calmed down. And not only sometimes have they said, oh, well, that's not what I thought you were saying, or, oh, I understand that. Okay. Some of them have said, I'm really glad you got back to me. I kind of see what you're saying. And we may not agree on everything, or we may not, or we may agree and we may not realize, because there's so much in miscommunication going on, whether in person or on the internet. But I think trying to step back and not react immediately, and to just think a little bit and contemplate about what people are saying, what people are thinking, and maybe why, is a good thing. Of course, I wish I could do that better in my own life, and sometimes I'm too quick to react, and I have lots of regrets about that. And a lot of times, part of the problem is we're all under so much pressure, and we don't have enough time to sit back and contemplate. And I think that's one of the biggest problems of our society too. And I think it's built in. We're not supposed to have that time. We're supposed to be working all the time, making money for the people who want to make money, and not think about all these things and not solve all these issues. But that's what I try to do. I try to step back, not react in anger, and try to talk to people as best I can, and try to, I guess the biggest thing is try to empathize as best I can. And that's not always easy, and I can't always do it, but that's what I try to do. And I'm sure I fail, but I try when I can.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you. These are impossible questions, and I just appreciate you sharing, how it shows up for you, and how you show up in return. That's the best that any of us can do. So I really appreciate that. And Kristine, well, I actually really think we've covered it beautifully. What I wanted to touch in with you about was primarily what was sparked for me out of that panel discussion, which again, I'll put the link in the show notes here to the Growth Busters panel you were on. And again, I appreciate how much we covered of that ground. And I'm hoping that next time, and in future conversations, I have a prediction. I have a prediction that we are in the honeymoon phase of the coronavirus pause, where those of us who are privileged enough to be able to take time off and have the resources to be able to stay in our, homes and have food to eat and so on. That's all working out at this point for the privileged folks. And I really predict that when the honeymoon is over, say in a month or 2 months or 3 months, not to mention what looks to be a soon to be arriving second wave of infections,
Mhm.
I predict we'll be having different conversations soon, where some of the luxury of imagining if we could all come together with this idea or this policy or this shift in taxation and the things we've been talking about. And I don't consider myself some sort of magical prognosticator of I don't predict well, but every once in a while I get a very strong hit. And this is a very strong hit, that this next round, when the honeymoon phase is over, is going to be like something certainly no one that's alive now has seen anything like it before. The level of chaos, the level of disruption of virtually every human system, it's collapse is what I think is inevitable here. So that's my prediction. And you're one of the top folks I would love to speak with about as various things unfold. And I don't mean that in a glib and humorous way, even though I had a slight smirk on my face there. It's really just the irony. I have a little bit of a hard time with the scale of the irony going on. So I sincerely would love to continue to be in touch with you on a regular basis, keep getting your seeing. That's, I think, where so much of this podcast is going to go in this coming year, is getting as clear a view of the projections of the analysis of what's going on and where we're headed. And then the other half of what this podcast is going to be talking about is what are the advanced practices that we can put together both individually and as small groups to stay sane in these times.
And to help one another, which I think is going to be a humongous factor, because I'm kind of envisioning for the future what you're envisioning. I see it already as we're opening up the economy and people are going back to work, and suddenly all these evictions will happen that have been put on hold, and suddenly all these people are going to be homeless.
Yeah.
And this is a reality. And I think there's, the sad thing is when we're at the bottom, we have the most potential for change, because people finally see what has been going on all along, but that they've been blinded to or had their rose-colored glasses on. And then those who are hurting most see that it can happen to them too. And it's a horrible way for change to happen, but I think it's more possible. So I don't know, it could go either way.
Yeah. Well, Kristine, I wish you the best in whatever you're holding in your life that's challenging. And I wish that for us all. And I really look forward to the next time we get to talk. And once again, great job in participating in that Growth Busters panel. I found that it's one of the very few panels that I see really worth listening to and participating in, is what you were a part of there, having conversations for possibility in a world that is in desperate need of truly new possibilities. So thanks so much for your work.
Thank you too. And thank you for all your work. And by the way, we are following up on that panel, because I guess we felt like we didn't even articulate enough possibilities and solutions. So we will be doing it again, and I'm not sure when it'll be out there, but I'll try to let people know who I'm in touch with, and surely let you know.
Good. I'll be sure to relay it to all the folks that watch here. All right. You take good care.
You too. Thanks for having me again.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.